Sarah Collins pressed her trembling hands against the white satin of her wedding dress, feeling the weight of the secret that threatened to destroy the most important day of her life. In just 30 minutes, she would walk down the aisle toward David Morgan, the man who believed he knew everything about the woman he was about to marry. But hidden beneath layers of tulle and lace was a truth so devastating that Sarah had spent 3 months perfecting the art of deception, terrified that honesty would cost her the only love she'd ever known. What David would discover on their wedding night would either prove that love could conquer anything or destroy them both forever. The mirror in the small room behind Redemption Creek Church reflected a bride who looked perfect on the surface, but Sarah could see the terror in her own green eyes, the way her hands shook as she adjusted the full skirt that concealed her carefully guarded secret. She'd spent months learning to walk differently, to sit gracefully, to hide the mechanical reality that had replaced flesh and bone after that terrible afternoon when her life changed forever. October 15th, 1887 had started as an ordinary day in the Montana Territory. Sarah had been riding her favorite mare, Buttercup, along the familiar trail that connected her family's ranch to the main road leading into town. She'd made the journey hundreds of times before, carrying supplies and messages between the Collins Ranch and the growing settlement of Redemption Creek. The trail wound through stands of aspen trees that had turned golden with autumn, their leaves dancing in the crisp mountain air like nature's own celebration. Sarah had been humming her favorite hymn, completely at peace with the world and excited about her upcoming engagement to David Morgan, the handsome blacksmith who'd been courting her for 2 years with patient devotion. The mountain lion appeared without warning, a massive tawny blur launching itself from an overhanging rock ledge directly into Buttercup's path. The mare reared in terror, her scream of fear echoing through the canyon as she lost her footing on the narrow trail. Sarah felt herself falling through space, the world spinning in a chaos of hooves, rocks, and golden leaves before everything went black. When she woke up 3 days later in the doctor's makeshift clinic above the general store, her left leg was gone below the knee, crushed beyond salvation in the rockslide that followed her fall. Dr. Henderson had been kind but direct about her situation. The leg couldn't be saved, but her life could be, thanks to the quick thinking of a traveling merchant who'd found her unconscious and bleeding among the rocks. The amputation had been performed with the crude tools available in a frontier town, but Dr. Henderson had done his best to ensure she could eventually walk again with the help of a prosthetic device he could order from back east. Sarah had listened to his explanations with growing horror, not because of the physical reality of her loss, but because of what it would mean for her future with David. In 1887 Montana, disabled women were viewed as burdens rather than partners. Marriage was about building families, managing households, and contributing to the hard work of frontier life. A woman who couldn't pull her weight, who required special accommodations and care, was considered damaged goods that no respectable man would willingly choose. Sarah had seen the way people looked at old Pete, the prospector who'd lost his arm in a mining accident. Even men struggled to find acceptance and employment after losing limbs, and women faced far worse discrimination. The prosthetic leg had arrived 6 weeks later, a marvel of Eastern engineering crafted from wood, leather, and metal springs that Dr. Henderson assured her would allow nearly normal movement once she learned to use it properly. The learning process had been agony, both physical and emotional, as Sarah struggled to master the unfamiliar weight and mechanism while battling the depression that threatened to swallow her whole. But gradually, painfully, she'd taught herself to walk again, to move with enough grace that casual observers might not notice her disability if she was careful about her clothing and movements. The decision to hide her condition from David had been born of desperation and terror. When he'd visited during her recovery, she'd been confined to bed with what she told him was a severe riding injury that would heal completely given time. As weeks passed and she grew stronger with the prosthetic, Sarah found herself trapped by her own deception. How could she tell the man she loved that she'd been lying to him for months? How could she risk losing him when he was the only bright spot in her dramatically altered future? David Morgan was everything a frontier woman could want in a husband. He was strong, capable, and kind, with the steady income of a skilled blacksmith and the respect of everyone in Redemption Creek. At 28, he was ready to settle down and start a family, and he'd chosen Sarah Collins as his bride after a courtship filled with gentle romance and genuine affection. He believed he was marrying a healthy, whole woman who could bear his children and share the demanding work of building a life together on the frontier. Sarah's deception had required constant vigilance and careful planning. She'd insisted on long engagements to allow time for her supposed injuries to heal, had worn only full skirts and long dresses that concealed her prosthetic, and had avoided situations that might expose her secret. Dancing had become impossible, horseback riding a thing of the past, and intimate moments had been carefully managed to prevent discovery. Each lie had led to another until Sarah felt trapped in a web of deception that grew more complex every day. Now, 30 minutes before her wedding, Sarah faced the moment she'd been dreading since accepting David's proposal. Tonight, in the privacy of their marriage bed, there would be no hiding, no careful positioning, no excuses that could explain away the mechanical reality of her new body. David would discover the truth, and Sarah would learn whether the man she loved could accept not just her disability, but the months of lies that had brought them to this moment. The sound of organ music drifting through the thin walls of the church preparation room signaled that Sarah's time for hiding was nearly over. Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife who'd been helping her with final preparations, bustled around adjusting the train of Sarah's dress with the efficiency of someone who'd assisted dozens of frontier brides over the years. The older woman's kind face showed no hint that she suspected anything unusual about this particular wedding, though Sarah wondered if her nervousness was more obvious than she hoped. Every frontier community had learned to mind their own business about other people's secrets, but Sarah's hands were shaking so violently that she could barely hold her bouquet of wild mountain flowers. The weight of her prosthetic felt heavier than usual today, the unfamiliar pressure of the wedding dress's full skirt making her gait feel even more unnatural than it had during months of careful practice. Sarah had rehearsed walking down the church aisle dozens of times in the privacy of her family's ranch house, timing her steps to avoid the telltale rhythm that might give away her secret. But today, with her future hanging in the balance, every step felt like a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. David was waiting at the altar in his finest black suit, the same one he'd worn to church socials and town meetings since Sarah had known him. She could see him through the gap in the door, tall and handsome, and completely unaware that his bride was about to deceive him in front of God and the entire community of Redemption Creek. His dark hair was slicked back with care, and his hands were clasped behind his back in the patient pose she'd come to associate with his steady, reliable character. David Morgan was the kind of man who kept his promises, who worked hard and treated people with respect, who deserved a wife who could be honest with him about something as fundamental as her own body. The small church was packed with friends and neighbors who'd known both families for years, their faces bright with the joy that frontier communities felt when young people found love and committed to building futures together. Sarah's parents sat in the front pew, her mother dabbing at tears of happiness with a lace handkerchief while her father shifted uncomfortably in his Sunday clothes. They had no idea that their daughter was walking toward marriage carrying a secret that could destroy everything they'd hoped for her future. John Collins had worked his whole life to build a ranch that could support his family with dignity, and Elizabeth Collins had raised her daughter to be the kind of woman any man would be proud to marry. Neither parent suspected that their careful planning and years of sacrifice might be undone by their daughter's inability to trust the man she claimed to love. As Sarah stepped into the aisle, the congregation rose in the traditional show of respect for the bride, and she felt the weight of their expectations settling around her like a physical burden. These people had known her since childhood, had watched her grow from a spirited girl who could outride most boys to a capable young woman who helped manage her family's cattle operation with skill and determination. They saw her as strong, honest, and wholesome, exactly the kind of frontier wife who could help build a thriving community in the harsh Montana territory. None of them imagined that beneath her beautiful white dress, Sarah was hiding a deformity that would mark her as damaged goods in the unforgiving social structure of the American West. Each step toward the altar required conscious thought and careful balance, the prosthetic leg responding to her movements with mechanical precision that felt nothing like the natural grace she'd once taken for granted. Sarah focused on David's face, using his steady presence as an anchor to keep from stumbling or revealing the awkward truth of her condition. He was smiling at her with such pure love and anticipation that Sarah's heart broke a little more with every step. David believed he was watching his perfect bride approach, ready to begin a life filled with shared work, children, and the deep partnership that frontier marriage required. He had no idea that the woman he loved had been lying to him for months about something that would fundamentally change their future together. Reverend Walsh stood ready to perform the ceremony, his worn Bible open to the familiar passages about love, honor, and commitment that had joined countless couples in this same small church. The Reverend had baptized both Sarah and David as children, had watched them grow up in his congregation, and had counseled them about the sacred nature of marriage during their brief engagement. He believed he was uniting two honest young people who would build their life together on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. Sarah wondered what he would think if he knew that one half of this couple was starting their marriage with a deception that violated everything the church taught about honesty between spouses. As she reached the altar and took her place beside David, Sarah caught the scent of his familiar cologne mixed with the nervous perspiration that even the most confident men experienced on their wedding day. His hand found hers during the opening prayer, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture of support and connection that had become natural between them during their courtship. But today, even his loving touch felt like another layer of deception, another moment when Sarah was accepting comfort and affection under false pretenses. Chapter 3: The wedding ceremony proceeded with the timeless rhythm that had joined frontier couples for generations. But Sarah felt as though she were watching it happen to someone else, her mind trapped in a fog of terror and desperate hope. Reverend Walsh's voice carried clearly through the small church as he spoke about the sacred bonds of marriage, the importance of honesty between spouses, and the challenges that frontier couples would face together in building lives from wilderness and determination. Each word about truth and trust felt like a physical blow to Sarah's already fractured composure, reminding her that she was standing at God's altar while living a lie that grew more devastating with each passing moment. David's responses to the traditional vows rang with sincerity and strength, his deep voice carrying easily to every corner of the church as he promised to love, honor, and cherish the woman beside him through whatever hardships their frontier life might bring. When he spoke about accepting her in sickness and in health, Sarah nearly broke down completely, the irony of those words cutting through her like a blade. David believed he was promising to care for a healthy woman who might someday face illness or injury, not someone who was already hiding a profound disability that would affect every aspect of their married life together. Her own vows came out as barely audible whispers, her voice catching on the words about honesty and faithfulness that felt like mockery given the magnitude of her deception. The congregation leaned forward to hear her responses, attributing her emotional state to normal bridal nerves rather than the crushing weight of guilt and terror that was making it difficult for her to breathe. Sarah's mother smiled encouragingly from the front pew, completely unaware that her daughter was on the verge of collapse from the strain of maintaining her carefully constructed facade. When Reverend Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, David's kiss was gentle and full of promise, tasting of the peppermint drops he'd nervously consumed before the ceremony. Sarah tried to lose herself in the familiar comfort of his embrace, but even this moment of connection felt tainted by the knowledge that she was accepting his love under false pretenses. The applause from their friends and family seemed to come from a great distance, the joyful celebration of their union a stark contrast to the dread that was growing in Sarah's chest like a living thing. The reception at the church social hall passed in a blur of congratulations, wedding cake, and forced smiles as Sarah navigated the social requirements of a frontier bride while constantly monitoring her movements to avoid revealing her secret. Dancing was impossible, of course, but she managed to deflect questions about her reluctance by claiming fatigue and overwhelming emotion. David stayed close to her side throughout the afternoon, his protective presence both comforting and heartbreaking as he played the role of devoted new husband to a woman who was deceiving him with every breath. As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Sarah felt the approaching reality of their wedding night like an impending storm. The small house that David had built for their married life waited just a few blocks from the church, complete with the comfortable bedroom where they would finally be alone together for the first time as husband and wife. There would be no more excuses, No more careful positioning or strategic clothing choices. Tonight, David would discover the truth that Sarah had been hiding since their engagement, and she would learn whether their love was strong enough to survive both her disability and her months of deception. The walk to their new home felt like a death march, though David chatted easily about their future plans and the improvements he wanted to make to the house and his blacksmith shop. His excitement about their life together was infectious under normal circumstances, but tonight it only made Sarah's guilt more unbearable. This good man deserved better than a wife who had built their entire relationship on a foundation of lies, who had robbed him of the chance to make an informed decision about the woman he was choosing to spend his life with. Their little house glowed warmly in the evening light, windows golden with lamplight and welcoming in the way that only a home prepared with love could be. David had spent weeks getting everything ready for his bride, hanging new curtains that Sarah had sewn during their engagement, arranging furniture that would accommodate their life together, creating a space where they could build the family they'd talked about so often during their courtship. Sarah wondered bitterly if those plans would survive the next hour. David carried her across the threshold with traditional ceremony, his strong arms lifting her easily as they crossed into their married life together. Sarah tried to memorize the feeling of safety and love in his embrace, knowing it might be the last time she experienced such pure happiness in his arms. The bedroom was beautiful in the soft lamplight, decorated with flowers from well-meaning friends and prepared for the romantic wedding night that every frontier bride was supposed to anticipate with joy rather than terror. As David set her gently on her feet beside their marriage bed, Sarah knew that the moment of truth had finally arrived. Her hands shook as she turned to face the man she loved, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether their marriage would survive its first night. The weight of her prosthetic felt enormous beneath her wedding dress, a mechanical reminder of all the ways she'd failed to be the woman David believed he'd married. "David," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name as tears began to flow freely down her cheeks. Before tonight goes any further, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you months ago." The confusion and concern in his dark eyes made her heart break all over again. But Sarah forced herself to continue with the confession that would either save or destroy them both. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "Look under the dress." David's confusion deepened at Sarah's strange request, his brow furrowing as he took in her tear-streaked face and trembling hands. This wasn't how he'd imagined their wedding night beginning, with his bride weeping and asking him to look under her dress, as if she were hiding some terrible secret rather than sharing the intimate joy that should mark the beginning of their married life together. The lamplight cast dancing shadows across the bedroom walls, creating an atmosphere that should have been romantic but instead felt heavy with dread and unspoken fears. Sarah's obvious distress was breaking David's heart, though he had no idea what could possibly be wrong with the woman he'd just pledged his life to in front of God and their entire community. "Sarah, sweetheart, what's wrong?" David asked gently, reaching out to cup her face in his calloused hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that continued to flow despite her efforts to compose herself. "Whatever it is, we can face it together. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Sharing our burdens as well as our joys." His voice carried all the patience and love that had made Sarah fall for him in the first place, the steady strength that had convinced her he was the kind of man who could weather any storm life threw at them. But this storm was bigger than anything either of them had ever faced, and Sarah wasn't sure their love was strong enough to survive what she was about to reveal. Sarah stepped back from his comforting touch, her decision made despite the terror that was making it difficult to breathe. "Please, David, just look, and then decide if you still want to be married to me." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried enough finality that David's expression shifted from confusion to genuine alarm. Something in her tone suggested this wasn't about wedding night nerves or maidenly shyness, but about something far more serious that could fundamentally change their relationship. With infinite gentleness, David knelt before his bride and began to lift the layers of white satin and tulle that made up her wedding dress, his movements careful and respectful as he'd been taught to treat the woman he loved. Sarah closed her eyes, unable to watch his face as the truth was finally revealed after months of careful concealment. The rustle of fabric seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Each layer lifted, bringing them closer to the moment that would either destroy their marriage or prove that love truly could conquer anything. David's hands stilled completely when he saw what Sarah had been hiding beneath her beautiful dress. Where he'd expected to find the familiar curves of the legs he'd glimpsed during their innocent courtship moments, there was instead a mechanical contraption of wood, leather, and metal that gleamed dully in the lamplight. The prosthetic leg was a marvel of Eastern engineering, carefully crafted to allow mobility and function, but it was undeniably artificial, a replacement for flesh and bone that had been lost in the accident Sarah had never fully explained. The silence stretched between them like an eternity, broken only by the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing as she waited for David's reaction to her devastating secret. She could feel him staring at the prosthetic, processing what he was seeing and what it meant for their future together. In 1887 Montana Territory, a disabled wife was considered a burden rather than a partner, someone who would require care and accommodation rather than contributing equally to the demanding work of frontier life. Sarah had seen how the community treated families dealing with disability, the whispered pity and practical concerns about productivity and survival that colored every interaction. How long? David's voice was hoarse with shock, but Sarah was surprised to hear no disgust or anger in his tone, only a kind of stunned bewilderment as he tried to process this revelation. How long have you been? When did this happen? His hands hovered near the prosthetic as if he wanted to touch it, but wasn't sure if he should. His mind clearly racing to reconcile this reality with everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd just married. 3 months before our engagement, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking on the confession she'd rehearsed countless times, but never thought she'd actually have the courage to make. A mountain lion spooked my horse on the trail to town. I fell into a rock slide, and Dr. Henderson couldn't save the leg. The words came out in a rush, months of suppressed truth finally breaking free like water through a broken dam. I've been lying to you ever since, David. About my recovery, about why I couldn't dance or ride or... I've been lying about everything. David sat back on his heels, his face pale with shock as the full magnitude of Sarah's deception became clear. She'd not only hidden a profound disability that would affect every aspect of their married life, but she'd spent their entire engagement lying to him about her condition, robbing him of the chance to make an informed decision about their future together. The betrayal of trust was almost as devastating as the physical reality of her amputation, calling into question everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd just committed his life to. "You didn't trust me," he said quietly, the hurt in his voice cutting through Sarah more effectively than any anger could have. "For months, you looked me in the eye and lied to me about something this important. Did you think so little of my character that you believed I'd abandon you if I knew the truth?" His questions were fair and devastating, each one highlighting the ways that fear had made Sarah hurt the man she loved most in the world. Sarah collapsed onto the edge of their marriage bed, her carefully constructed composure finally crumbling completely under the weight of guilt and terror. "I was so afraid," she sobbed, the words tumbling out through her tears. "Everyone knows that disabled women are burdens, that no man wants a wife who can't pull her weight or give him healthy children. I thought if you knew, you'd find some polite way to end our engagement, and I couldn't bear losing you. You're the only good thing in my life, David, and I was terrified that the truth would take you away from me." David stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate as he processed everything Sarah had told him. She watched his face, searching for any sign of his emotions, any hint of what he was thinking or feeling about the woman he'd discovered himself married to. The silence stretched between them until Sarah was certain he was trying to figure out how to annul their marriage and escape the trap her deception had created. Then, to her complete shock, David began removing his jacket and vest with the same methodical care he brought to all his work. Sarah watched in confusion as he rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt and knelt beside the bed where she sat crying. Without a word, he began examining her prosthetic with the careful attention of a craftsman, his blacksmith's eye taking in the mechanisms and materials that allowed the device to function. "The spring mechanism here is clever," he said quietly, his voice carrying the professional interest he brought to any well-made tool or machine. "And this leather harness distributes the weight efficiently. Dr. Henderson did good work getting this fitted properly." Sarah stared at him in bewilderment. unable to understand why he was discussing the technical aspects of her prosthetic instead of addressing the betrayal and deception that had brought them to this moment. David looked up at her then, his dark eyes holding something that looked remarkably like admiration rather than disgust or pity. "Do you know what I see when I look at this, Sarah?" he asked gently, his hand gesturing toward the prosthetic that had been the source of so much shame and fear. "I see a woman who survived a terrible accident and fought her way back to walking again. I see someone strong enough to learn to use this contraption and brave enough to hide her struggle from everyone around her. I see the woman I fell in love with, who's even more remarkable than I realized." Sarah's tears redoubled at his words, but they were tears of relief and wonder rather than fear and shame. "You're not disgusted? You don't want to find a way out of this marriage?" The questions came out in a rush, months of terror and self-loathing making it difficult for her to believe that David could truly accept what she'd hidden from him. David's answer came not in words, but in actions that spoke louder than any speech. He reached out and carefully, gently, ran his fingers along the edge of the prosthetic where it met Sarah's remaining leg, his touch reverent rather than clinical. "This is part of you now," he said simply, "which makes it part of us. I didn't marry your legs, Sarah. I married your heart, your mind, your spirit, everything that makes you who you are." Standing up, David cupped Sarah's face in his hands and looked directly into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm hurt that you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth," he said honestly, "and we'll need to work on rebuilding that trust between us. But Sarah, do you really think I'm so shallow that I'd stop loving you because of this? Do you think my feelings for you were so fragile that they'd crumble the moment I discovered you weren't physically perfect?" The kiss that followed was different from any they'd shared during their courtship, deeper and more meaningful because it came with full knowledge and acceptance of who Sarah truly was. When David pulled back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears of his own. "We'll face this together," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "All of it. The physical challenges, the trust we need to rebuild, the future we're going to create. Because that's what love means, Sarah. It means choosing each other every day, especially when things get difficult." As the evening progressed, and they talked honestly for the first time since Sarah's accident, she began to understand that her fears about disability and worthiness had been largely self-imposed. David was indeed hurt by her deception, but his love for her was exactly as strong and faithful as she'd always believed it to be. He asked practical questions about her limitations and abilities, not to judge, but to understand how they could build a life together that accommodated her needs while allowing them both to thrive. The physical intimacy that followed was tender and careful, with David showing the same patience and attentiveness that he brought to all his relationships. Sarah discovered that her prosthetic didn't make her less desirable to the man who truly loved her, and that honesty between them created a deeper connection than any deception ever could have. For the first time since her accident, Sarah felt truly whole, not because her body was perfect, but because she was loved completely and without reservation. In the days and weeks that followed, word of Sarah's disability gradually spread through the Redemption Creek community, but the reactions were far more accepting than she'd feared. David's unwavering support and obvious devotion to his wife influenced how others viewed her condition, and Sarah discovered that frontier communities were often more practical than judgmental about people who could contribute despite physical limitations. Her skills with ranch management and her intelligence were still valuable assets, and her marriage to David provided the social protection she needed to thrive. The trust between them took longer to fully rebuild, with honest conversations about fear, deception, and the courage required for true intimacy becoming a regular part of their married life. But every day brought them closer together, proving that love built on truth and acceptance was infinitely stronger than any relationship founded on deception and false pretenses. Sarah learned that her worth wasn't determined by her physical perfection, and David proved that real love could indeed conquer any obstacle when two people were committed to facing life's challenges together. Their marriage became a testament to the power of acceptance and the strength that comes from being truly known and loved despite our imperfections and fears. In choosing honesty over deception and love over fear, Sarah and David built a partnership that would weather any storm and provide a foundation for the family they would eventually create together. This incredible story of courage, honesty, And unconditional love reminds us that our greatest fears often hide our most beautiful truths. If Sarah and David's journey of overcoming deception and embracing authentic love moved your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because everyone deserves to hear stories that show us love's power to transform our deepest shame into our greatest strength. Share this powerful tale with someone who needs to remember that they are worthy of love exactly as they are. And tell me in the comments which moment touched you most deeply. Sarah's terrifying courage in revealing her secret, David's incredible acceptance and love, or their beautiful journey toward rebuilding trust. Your engagement helps these life-changing stories reach others who desperately need hope. What story of authentic love conquering fear should we explore next? Your heart matters, your story matters, and you are never alone in your struggles.